Welcome back to the Unapologetic Anthropologist. We are on episode 3. Thank you guys for joining us and sticking around. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment on this video and subscribe for any of the new things that are coming up. Today we are talking about why ancient Egypt wasn't exactly what Hollywood told you and exploring one of the most famous ancient civilizations and really separating the archaeological evidence from some of the popular myths that are out there. So let us jump right in and get started. So the problem isn't that some of these things existed, secret tombs, a civilization frozen in time, some of their great works like the pyramids or maybe the Sphinx that you're familiar with. But the problem is that they've become the entire story, this Hollywood movie narrative that we know versus the actual fascinating society that was ancient Egypt. The real ancient Egypt was far more vast and fascinating than we could ever really put into a Hollywood film. So we're going to dive into the reality versus movie conception that we know here, at least in America. Now, this is one of my favorite slides, really just to go over the timeline of humanity in general, not just ancient Egypt, but it really puts into perspective the vast amount of human history and our human story that comes before some of those mainstream things that pop up, like the story of Cleopatra. As you see here on this slide, the United States is celebrating our 250th birthday, and we are that itty bitty little yellow sliver all the way to the right hand side. And then you can see the gap of time for what we know as far as Cleopatra, but then the 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history and their human story that follow prior to some of these mainstream events that we know of. This is how massive history really is, and this is just a glimpse of the ancient Egyptians, let alone Mesopotamia and some of these other ancient societies that paint a much larger human picture than some of us are used to viewing. So let's just jump into our comparison right off the bat, myths versus the data. And again, with the myths, I'm not saying these things didn't happen. We know there was a group of enslaved population during this time. But the misconception here is that everyone was a slave. Now remember, this was a large society. This was an empire at the time. So there is evidence of worker villages, specialized labor forces, these skilled labor villages and populations similar to how we have it today. They were specialized as well as, of course, an enslaved population. We do see some whips. We do see some different, things that come along with slavery, which we are going to jump into that particular topic later in the season. But we do also see some proof of medical care. There was even that specialization of taking care of people and their needs. And then, of course, burials as well, that people were not simply just discarded. There was some sort of ritualistic meaning behind deaths and where those were placed. The evidence doesn't support an image of aimless, chained, enslaved workers. The archaeology actually changes the story and gives us more evidence of a very diverse, large population of people. So, with all this wonderful evidence, how did we get from archaeological evidence to this Hollywood story that we know today? Curses make a great movie, but archaeology actually requires some evidence and some data, not just superstition. So, of course, we have the tomb opened. The media, like anything, causes a craze, jumps into that, takes their own spin, and now turns it into something that is movie worthy. They're exaggerating details, they're hyperextending different facts, and now we have this legend that Hollywood takes and runs with and has created this entire new historical narrative. So the question really becomes, why do we love these mysterious explanations when the ordinary facts are usually the ones that are more accurate and fascinating? So it really takes that trained eye to dig a little bit deeper. Maybe there's some truth to these myths, but let's take a look at what those people actually lived through and what legacy they're leaving behind. Now, if you've listened to some of my previous episodes or some of the short content that's out there, you will know that I am fascinated by human migration, how we move, trade routes, things like that. So ancient Egypt is actually one of my hot topics because it wasn't this isolated consistent building of different structures. It's actually a active crossroad connecting distant cultures, villages, trades, cultural exchange, language. Anthropologists now study how those cultures interact. Rather than treating each civilization separately, we really want to come in and find the hub of how they intermingled, intertwined, and then kind of set course for the world that had followed. So definitely a fun rabbit hole to dive into. If you're familiar with the Silk Road and things like that, you're definitely going to want to take a look at the trading hub that was ancient Egypt. We have multiple connections: the Mediterranean, the East, of course, migration from Africa, and bringing a plentiful of culture and goods through the area. Now, of course, we talked about a little bit earlier in this episode that there was, of course, different populations of people during this time. You have a giant society over a vast geographical landscape. So we do see, like I said before, the enslaved population, but then you have this hierarchy as well. Most Egyptians never lived in palaces. The real story doesn't just focus on pharaohs and tombs and things like that. It's about millions of ordinary people, just like we have today, who are working, raising families, farms, building communities. And those are the people that really laid the foundation for the society that we know as ancient Egypt. Now, of course, Hollywood's going to focus on the pharaohs and the royals here at the very tip of our pyramid. I love how this pyramid is upside down, kind of toppling this narrative that we know from films. But you have your farmers and your craftsmen, all those specialized skills we talked about that are going to be the base and foundation of our society. And then, of course, like any hierarchy or class system, you have your merchants, your priests, some of your well-to-do family, and then your pharaohs and royals. So a really diverse amount of people coming together, but similar to today's society as well. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comment, because I find this really interesting. Now, at this point in our podcast, you're probably saying to yourself, okay, Rebecca, we know ancient Egypt. Everybody knows about the Egyptians. Like, why are we talking about this? Why is this even remotely important to humanity today? And it's really because we're not interested in Egypt's mysteries and all these, different spin-offs and narratives that media has created, but we're interested in it because it's one of the greatest human civilizations, one of the greatest human accomplishments, the pyramid and the Sphinx, and some of the long-lasting legacies that this culture provided for us. We take a closer look at the evidence, and more complicated, more interesting stories, human stories, come to light, not just pharaohs and royals and what would have been considered Hollywood's important people, but the real human story, the real important communities and cultures and trade networks that made all of this happen. That's what we're here for. How do we take this approach? How do we look at this wonderful society from the most humanistic point that we can, especially in our modern time? So I really want to challenge your cycle of understanding and thinking when it comes to a lot of these popular ancient societies. The first one, we're going to start with taking that popular cultural narrative and using maybe some interdisciplinary, maybe some anthropological questioning to dig a little bit deeper, take a look at some of the archaeological evidence that was found, and realize that there's more to this picture. Just like any famous painting, there is more to what we see than on the canvas. A movie tells a story often enough, we just accept it as history. Anthropology teaches us that it's better to ask questions, dig deeper, and follow the true data before we assume anything about anyone or any human story, even the most fascinating ones. And I know today was a short episode, but definitely want to hear your thoughts or any topics that you'd like to see discussed in the future. But just wrapping it up here for us on episode 3. Anthropology, again, we're not here to challenge history or make it less exciting. We're here to make it more accurate, to fully understand not only the fascinating myths and secret and some of those things that attract us to our human history, but the accuracy. What did people actually go through? What was life like for a traditional ancient Egyptian farmer? So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. Definitely share this podcast with someone who's interested in ancient Egypt or Egypt in general. Make sure that you stay tuned for podcast episode 4 that's going to come out later this week. It's going to be one of the best podcast episodes this season, so you will not want to miss that. And in the meantime, stay curious and unapologetic, and I will see you next time.